Hello, it's Philip Taylor speaking from Richmond Green Chambers in London. This morning I'm looking at a book which has come from Informa, who are now part of the Taylor and Francis group, and Routledge. And we've reviewed a number of Informa titles in the past. They are the preeminent maritime law specialists, and if you do anything in maritime law you will know of their existence and the very high quality of the law which is contained in these books. Today I'm looking at volume 1 of a series of volumes on what is given the general title of the International Maritime Conventions. And the volume 1 that we're looking at is specific to the carriage of goods and passengers by sea, and it's been written by Francesco Berlingieri, if I've pronounced the name correctly. I hope I have, but this is a very good book. There is a little change which is mentioned at the beginning, because this is actually part of, it says Lloyd's Shipping Law Library, but in fact that's not what it is. It's now called the Maritime and Transport Law Library, and that's the little sort of change that's taken place. This is an interesting book. It's 450 pages long, so that's the index at the back, quite a detailed one. And then when you get in, there are some appendices which are very useful. What you have got, again, which you would expect, you've got paragraph numbering at the sides there, and you've got some footnoting, which of course is very useful. There's a lot of detail in this publication. As I've indicated, that's actually the main front cover. It's Informa Law from Routledge is the title they now call it. This sets out the International Maritime Conventions series, obviously volume 1, and it mentions a bit about Francesco here, and explains who he is, and we'll talk a little bit more about him later. Then you've got the contents themselves there, running through, and there's quite a lot of content there. I'm not going to show all of them. There's a useful glossary which is also available, which is, I think, very helpful, because, and also you've got the international organisations, because this is an international book. We are global with our activities. There are also some other useful little glossaries there, points which you can see, and I think that does help when you're dealing with something in the nature of maritime law, where you're dealing with a whole different series of nation states. And you've got a general introduction there which starts the thing off, and then you get into the main work with chapter 1, which is the International Convention for the Unification of Certain Rules Relating to Bills of Lading, which is very much part of international trade. If you did that model at say the bar school, which I in fact did, there's a very useful bit on the Rotterdam Rules as well. I didn't have this sort of thing available when I did my bar exams, and it's a pity I didn't in some ways, because I did the international trade model, and I did find it quite difficult because it's a very technical area, but I passed, and that's the important thing. So you do know about these books if you need to refer to them. Now, we've written a review which is going to be in the journals and on the web, and we gave it the title, The Law of the Sea, Complex Maritime Conventions Examined and Explained. And what Francesco has done is he's tried his best to put it in as simple a set of terms as we can. It's a complex area. It's inevitable it's going to be, because you're involving a whole range of different languages and different nation states and so on. But what we say is this: for shipping lawyers, academics and students of maritime law worldwide, this book emerges as an indispensable work of reference. It's the latest title from the highly regarded Maritime Transport Law Library, published by Informa Law from Routledge. With at least 30 other titles in the series, Informa has established itself as the go-to publisher in maritime law. What is unique about this text is that it brings together in one volume all private international maritime law conventions, all 19 of them, accompanied by expert commentary and analysis. As if all this weren't enough, the book also examines a number of maritime conventions not yet in force, including the Rotterdam Rules. The author, Francesco Berlingieri, who's a specialist maritime lawyer based in Genoa, has completed what we think is a formidable task. Interestingly, his law firm is cited as the only firm to specialise in maritime law on, we assume, an exclusive basis. Genoa, by the way, rings a rather loud bell in maritime history, as we recall that Christopher Columbus was Genoese. The book contains detailed and complex subject matter, which fortunately is logically organised, with a detailed table of contents, a glossary, which I showed you earlier, and an index at the back, all of which facilitate navigation appropriately enough, in other words, looking things up. And it's actually quite easy to find things, I think, in the work. As the title indicates, Part 1 examines the carriage of goods by sea, and Part 2 will deal with the carriage of passengers by sea. So it's split into the two areas. The focus throughout touches on the almost innumerable attempts to unify maritime law internationally, starting from 1860 onward. The rather convoluted history of this process is summarised in the book's excellent general introduction, which I started off with, the second part of which deals with the ways in which international conventions may be implemented and the need for a uniform interpretation of them. Time will tell whether a similarly protracted and complicated process will accompany, for instance, any explorations to the moon. In other words, the argument that Times used fairly recently, I'm recording this in the summer of 2014, who owns the moon, as well as Mars and eventually deep space. So we're going to have all these issues, and obviously the conventions, which is actually quite old, the actual original conference to get the modern maritime conventions set up was actually some 30 odd years ago now, in fact more than that. And again, we have to revisit these subjects from time to time. So in his thorough coverage of conventions dealing with the carriage of goods and passengers by sea, the author deals with 4 conventions in particular, including the UN Convention on the International Carriage of Goods wholly or partly by sea in 2008, which is the Rotterdam Rules. These are reproduced in Appendix 3 of the 4 appendices, which also include the Hague-Visby Rules, the Hamburg Rules and the Athens Convention. So you've got everything there quite easily at your fingertips if that's the area that you advise on or work in. Let me conclude by saying this copiously footnoted book provides a rich source of references and research, including 5 tables, respectively, of conventions, cases, national legislation, European legislation, and the Travaux Préparatoires, which is legislative history, which is again of interest again across the sort of language and nations barriers. It's comprehensive, authoritative and scholarly, and it should eventually occupy pride of place in your library for every lawyer and advisor in maritime law. And as I've said, the publication date is 2014. That's the book again, just to show you. As I say, it's not a particularly heavy book, 400 odd pages. Just return to my favourite subject, the Rotterdam Rules, which is there, and just remind you again of the contents at the front, because you do start off with the general introduction. There is no preface as such, so I think the general introduction will give you some idea of what Francesco is aiming to produce with this work. I'd like to thank Routledge very much for producing this, now under the obviously as part of what is now the Informa collection of works, very specific to us in maritime law matters. And as I've said, do look at the web and the journals for our review, and thank you to all concerned. This is an excellent publication, right at the top of the maritime law list, and it's very much where the law is and the advice that you would be looking if you need to give client advice to people. So thank you to all concerned. Bye bye.